Thank you very much, Dr. Faslamd, for that very insightful overview and your assessment of India. Thank you very much to you and to the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy and the Diplomatic Academy for your invitation. And it's good to see all of you here today, despite a cold Vienna evening, to share some thoughts and ideas on India's global role. And I'm going to try and approach this topic in three interrelated sort of sections. Firstly, I'd like to make some general observations about India's contemporary situation. Thereafter, some general remarks about the current global scenario, and thereafter, maybe in a sense, link some of India's approaches to what is happening both within India and without. On India, as is fairly well known and was mentioned here, we are today the world's largest country in terms of population. And more importantly, I think the Indian population is a young one, with a median age of, in 2024, a median age of 28.4 years, which essentially means that more than half of India's 1.42 billion people are less than 28.4 years old. And over a quarter of Indians are actually are in the age group 0 to 14. So this is really a very young population. And equally importantly, and this needs to be said, the economic, health, and educational indicators of this population have been the best they have ever been and are getting better. India is thus not just a young country, but a more prosperous, healthy, and achievement-oriented society. Another key aspect of India is its democracy. It's not just the world's largest, but we believe that India's democracy is deeply embedded in our civilizational ethos. And as all of you would have seen, earlier this year, we had a remarkable exercise in electoral democracy, the world's largest and most complex exercise. And even the other day, I was watching some memes about the American election where they said, you know, India has 1 billion votes and they counted it in one day, and why is it still not being counted, all the votes in the US? It is a model of governmental and societal efficiency. And from the parliament in Delhi to the panchayats in the villages, we have, I would say, a very deep democratic spirit that permeates India. And this is not just in terms of the well-off citizens, but it is a democracy that works for our women, for our youth, and for sections of society that have been socially less privileged in the past. The third element which I want to highlight, which was mentioned in passing, is our economy. Today, the world's fifth largest, and hopefully by 2027, the world's third largest economy. More importantly, we are growing faster than any G20 economy, consistently. And the aspiration is that we should be able to double our GDP from about $3.5 trillion today to about more than $7.5 trillion by 2031. In other words, India's average GDP growth of each year is broadly about will be about $400 billion, which is more or less in the range of what I think Austria's overall GDP is. So this is really a reflection of the scale. And in fact, the interesting thing there is that it is estimated that 20% of all global growth in the next decade will be in India. Another significant aspect of this growth engine, that is India's economy, is that it's primarily domestic demand driven. And unlike some of the other economies that have grown basically by expanding their exports, India's growth is powered by domestic demand. And that has very serious implications in terms of how we see things. And our GDP export ratio is only about 20%, including goods and services. And this, I think, is a very big differentiator. So together, these three Ds, as Prime Minister Modi says, democracy, demography, and demand, are a critical enabler of India's global positioning and India's own growth. And I want to add a fourth D, if I may, and that is digital. And if you see, India is really at the forefront of the global digital economy. From the software services boom of the early 2000s, today our companies have become essential partners in digital transformation worldwide. There are over 1,600 global capability centers. These are so-called because this is where most of the R&D happens, are in India. And we're not talking about simple IT anymore. We're talking about AI, machine learning, cloud computing, Internet of Things, cybersecurity, etc. And this is mirrored within India by very successful progress on digital governance, driving forward financial inclusion, speedy delivery of government services, transparency, and probity in government. And with over 100 unicorns, we have a very vibrant innovation ecosystem. And this ecosystem is linked in terms of its linkages with the larger global knowledge ecosystem. Let me now shift the frame of reference and make a few comments on the current global situation. I don't intend to brief this audience about recent developments, but let me try and draw some trend lines, if I may, just so that we can discuss more about what India is doing. The first trend line, I would say, is that broader public participation in politics, driven by the social media, has created pressures on the political leadership everywhere. This has both a positive impact, because as a democracy, greater involvement of people in the democratic and public discourse is a positive, but it also creates certain challenges that all of you are well aware of. Second, geopolitics is back. After about, I would say, 2.5, 3 decades, when we were thinking that maybe geopolitics is a thing of the past, I think serious contestation between powers is now a reality of the modern international landscape. And we are witnessing this contestation not merely in geographical terms, but also in very, very serious functional domains, like technology, or critical minerals, for example. And you can see that manifested in the Indo-Pacific, in the Middle East, and of course in Europe, which you're very aware of. Third, COVID was a serious shock to international structures. It exposed some fault lines, some new ones, and made some old ones even more visible. Think about how long some of the African countries had to wait to get vaccines, and you understand what I'm trying to drive at. But more profoundly, it has forced a rethink on international supply chains and how production is organized and regulated. It has brought in the element of trust and shared values into economics, moving away from a non-political, if you will, discourse on globalization to a more nuanced and more politically aware approach towards how economics is structured. And this, I feel, will obviously produce winners and some losers. And this is a process that is currently underway. Four, irrespective of your ideology or interests, some issues necessitate global cooperation. Not cooperating in the broader global context is not really an option for any country or group of countries. You think about the climate change crisis. You think about the need to bring about equitable economic development, both within societies and between societies in larger global context. We need to work together as a global community. And there is no alternative but to engage with that process. And this global conversation has to operate on some ground rules. There is currently, of course, a lot of debate about what those ground rules are, should be, but the fact is that there is a broad understanding that these ground rules have to apply for this conversation to go forward. And in my personal view, these calls will grow louder, and all states, organizations, and even corporates have to show that they are adhering to these ground rules. One last point about the global situation is that fundamentals still matter. Peace, diplomacy, and dialogue are not merely slogans, they are key to making progress on all major issues of our day. Responsible behavior is central, especially for powerful countries whose actions impact everyone. Humanitarian support, relief for disasters, and other longer-term measures to build capacities and resilience across geographies will have to be prioritized, irrespective of who is having that conversation. Now, to move on, after those broad comments on what one sees as key trend lines in the global situation, what does India do? What role can India play? And what are we doing already? Here again, I don't want to get into a long discussion. I'm sure that there will be more conversations around. But let me just make a few summary observations so that we can discuss further. Firstly, as 1/6 of the world's population community, a strong, growing, and democratic India is automatically a factor for stability and economic development worldwide. India's success underlines that economic transformation is not just possible, but better done in a democratic framework. And I think this is a very important point that needs to be stressed, because there have been arguments that democracies and development don't necessarily go together, especially in the developing world. India's pace may have been slower, but I would argue that it is more inclusive, more ecologically sustainable, and will likely be more durable than any non-democratic alternative. Second, India is and it will be a global powerhouse of talent, which will drive our digital and knowledge future. The success of the global capability centers I mentioned, but you look at Indian professionals abroad, and in fact, the very mobility that the modern economy is driving will make this more and more likely. And India's markets and India's growth, as I mentioned, are opportunities for all countries to exploit. Thirdly, geopolitically speaking, India is part of the solution, and we are definitely not part of the problem. We have sought to maintain ties with all countries and in multiple frameworks. And we are currently one of the few countries with the ability to speak to all countries, to all parties, and to help with channels of communication where needed. And we've shown that we're willing to do so in as much as the parties concerned wish us to engage, and often even beyond that. And we recognize that solutions have to be found at the negotiating table and not on the battlefield. As Prime Minister said, this is not an era of war. Fourth, India will continue to champion the interests of our fellow developing countries. The changes in the global order cannot lead to a scenario where the less developed countries again have to pay the price. From our vaccine maitri, vaccine friendship during COVID, to our humanitarian assistance and disaster relief activities from the Pacific to East Africa, we have been helping in emergencies. We will continue to assist our developing country friends in building capacities through programs such as our ITEC, which have trained more than 100,000 public professionals in the past few decades. And we hope that our cost-effective and need-appropriate technologies, especially what we've achieved with digital public infrastructure, can be scaled up and taken to the rest of the world. And we feel that the developing countries can benefit from this digital transformation. Lastly, India will both support the global good and contribute what we can to address our shared challenges. Even as the world is struggling to find answers to the climate crisis, India has unveiled one of the most ambitious renewable energy programs. We have already created nearly 200,000 megawatts of renewable energy capacity, with the increase from 2022 to 2023 alone is around 14% in installed capacity. And we strongly support initiatives such as the International Solar Alliance, the Coalition on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, the Lifestyle for Environment, and so many other initiatives to try and create a sustainable future. Yes, we would like to see early and decisive changes to international structures, such as the United Nations and its Security Council. And we would like to see these mechanisms that are there, multilateral mechanisms, gain momentum, such as we did during our presidency of the G20 last year. And since we are in Vienna, one of the capitals of multilateral dialogue, we hope to see a multilateralism that allows more space for developing countries and for their development. Before I conclude, I should say a few words about the India-Austria partnership. I'll be very brief. I think we are at a point of decisive progress. We had a very successful visit by Prime Minister Modi in July. The political dialogue at the highest level underlined very great similarities in our approaches to global issues, and our perspectives have a good match. And there are excellent synergies, I would say, in terms of the economic and technological partnership that we can build. Austrian tech meets Indian scale and spurs shared innovation. And there is much to report on this, but I think that is the subject for another discussion, which we hope to have later. Thank you very much, and once again, for being here.